Discrimination on the basis of demographic attributes such as ethnicity, sex, sexual orientation, religion, age, etc., is a common feature of human life and has a definite impact on individuals and societies. It is interesting and of course relatively difficult for social scientists to measure the prevalence and the intensity of discrimination. Focusing on racial discrimination, many studies have found a clear difference in positive answers to job applications received by applicants with identical qualifications but different ethnic backgrounds. On the other hand, studies of individual behavior, some of them in real-life situations, have shown that bias and discrimination on ethnic grounds range from somewhat unusual to really rare. My guest for this episode, Lee Jussim, is a professor of psychology at Rutgers University, and he thinks that this apparent paradox can be lifted. So, hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be here with Professor Lee Jussim. Welcome back to the podcast, Professor.
Yeah, it's good to be back. It's been a while.
It's been a long time, something like 3 years and a half.
Yeah.
And we are still running, luckily.
Which is great.
We're really happy to have you back. So I need to introduce you or reintroduce you to the audience. I think now you're a distinguished professor at Rutgers University. So that's in the United States, for those who don't know. And you conduct your research there in the Department of Psychology.
Yep.
Your research has covered topics such as self-fulfilling prophecies, stereotypes, political bias, and social psychology. I think we covered most of those in the previous interview. You're also the author or editor, depending on of many books really, including Social Perception and Social Reality, which was published in 2012 and won an American Association of Publishers Prize for Best Book in Psychology. We can also cite another book, The Social Psychology of Morality, 2016, which you co-edited with Joseph Forgas and Paul van Lange. And so today I offered you to talk about discrimination for this conversation. It's a very fraught topic, I think it's fair to say. So we can open, or at least I can open, by saying that compared to what was the case a few decades ago, probably many more people now strongly believe that discrimination on the basis of ethnicity or sex or any other broadly similar demographic factor is wrong. At least the belief that it's wrong has probably become much more widespread. There are intense debates, however, regarding the prevalence and the intensity of the discrimination that remains in Western liberal democracies. So this is, the sort of overarching problem, and we can hope to illuminate it to some extent today. So the first question is very broad. We can probably break it down in several parts, but simply put, how do social scientists measure discrimination?
Well, I mean, probably there's actually a lot of answers to that, but the sort of gold standard are audit and audit type studies. And what an audit or audit type study is that either people who are matched on qualifications or resumes that are matched on qualifications, but which vary on the basis of race or sex or some other characteristic, go out into the world, and then one examines what happens to those people. So if they're applying for a job, do Black and white applicants receive different callbacks for interviews or different job offers? But that would be in a job context. There's other kinds of real world type settings, in much more like everyday type interactions, but it's fundamentally the same thing, where let's say a white or a black person or a person wearing hijab who kind of looks dark and vaguely Middle Eastern versus, some blonde white person sits down on a bus, and do people sit next to that person or do they sit further away? So that's a very sort of subtle form of discrimination. But these take place in the real world. And researchers then assess, are people from different groups treated similarly or differently? That's probably the gold standard. I mean, it can also be done experimentally, where you bring people into a lab and you have them evaluate or judge people from different groups who are otherwise identical. And do you get bias in those evaluations? That's another way to do it. You can do it in the lab that way. There's evaluations. There are various and sundry games that you can play in the lab where people receive rewards or punishments. Then there's usually a whole complicated setup. But the outcome is, do people from different demographic groups, are they treated the same or are they treated differently? Do they receive the same or different pattern of rewards and punishments? So those are like the main ways that discrimination would be assessed.
Okay. So in the case of these audit studies, at least, it's been common that these studies report very striking results in terms of differences. So you mentioned, I will put the links to the relevant articles that you posted on Psychology Today. I will put them in the description. And in one of those texts, you mentioned this result from a very recent and apparently quite reliable study, where they found that for job applications, the rate of callbacks between, say, white American and black American varies. I mean, white Americans have an advantage of 36% when they have an otherwise identical resume and qualifications.
Yes, and that's the summary statistic that emerged from a meta-analysis of studies going back decades. And it's a pretty solid number. I think it's plausible. There's nothing like weird about, like incredible about it or the design of the studies to lead me to have doubts about its viability. And the other main finding was that there really has been no change. There was no two studies produced the exact same result, but there was no evidence of a systematic change in that difference, that level of discrimination going back decades. So that 36% number is pretty solid. But, the studies are all limited. They're usually people applying for like entry-level jobs as opposed to professional level jobs. There's not, as far as I know, quite as much evidence regarding more professional level jobs. The evidence for those that I'm aware of shows some level of discrimination there also. So I just think that the numbers like this are always subject to change if and when new information comes in. That's the hesitancy you hear in me saying, yeah, it's a completely solid number, but the number's pretty solid. I believe the number. I believe 36% is about right for studies of callbacks when people apply for jobs.
Right. And so is it the case that for maybe jobs that require some higher qualifications, the difference might shrink to some extent?
Yeah. So I would say, to me, that is I can't put a number on that. And that's because there are some studies of like people with college degrees applying for jobs that show conventional racial discrimination, white favoritism. I'd have to go back and look. I don't know of a comparable meta-analysis that integrates all those and says, well, that level is 20% or 40%. So I can't do that. But what is also true, and this is like the big wild card, is that I think there is also reason to believe that many high-powered professional companies, law firms, tech firms, are highly motivated to diversify their workforce. And for good reasons, they're motivated to do that. And so because of what they perceive to be and what probably actually are benefits to a diversified workforce, then it's plausible to think that people from historically marginalized groups who are actively sought have an edge at being hired at those firms. But there's not good data on that, actually. I don't know of a comparable audit study for people seeking entry-level law jobs. So the absence of data means it's unclear. And even it's also possible that lots of things are possible, that firms make a lot of social justice sounding noises, but it's really a masquerade to allow them to continue to engage in the discrimination that they always do. So they say the right thing, but they don't do the right thing. And it's also possible that some firms are very serious about this, but many other firms that you don't hear about engage in very conventional discrimination. And so, and so the net would still be, in the population of such firms, conventional racial discrimination. So to me, that's ambiguous. It's very uncertain. I would say, at least I don't have real clear sense of good research that gives like a clear answer to the level of discrimination that occurs in those kind of jobs.
Right, and that's fair enough. Okay, it clarifies the current picture. Yes, so the I think what motivated you to write about this, among other things, probably, is that there is this apparent paradox, probably, because on the one side you have this very large difference, really, in terms at least of the figure we've mentioned for these maybe entry-level jobs which require low qualifications, very large difference in callbacks between equally qualified white and black applicants, whereas there's also been studies that look at, say, broadly the same topic but from a different angle, which is that they just look at individual acts of discrimination in various settings, and those reports generally appreciably and even far lower sometimes rates of discrimination. It can be as high as 20% might discriminate, say, on race grounds, but it can be as low as 1% or 2%, if memory serves me right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there were 3 papers that came out early this year, all around the same time. And they reported a combined total of, I don't remember, 8, 10, 12 studies. One paper had like 8 studies in it, and others had 1 or 2. So it was a lot of new information, newly published studies. And they examined discrimination in a variety of contexts. One was in this experimental game type situation, assigning rewards and punishments. One was actually in responding to Airbnb requests. And the other was a series of studies that looked at a slew of these natural situations. One was sitting on a bus. Another was a person like drops a lot of stuff that they're holding either in an elevator or a vestibule. I forget exactly. And the issue is, do people help? And does that vary depending on whether the person was black or white or wearing a hijab or not? And there were, it might have also been black, white, it might have been Asian or white as well. And they did it in a wide variety of ways. And those studies consistently reported it generally reported discrimination levels in single digits. It did pop into the double digits, and the highest was around 20%, but in general, it was in single digits. So this looks like very, very low levels. In some sense, you can look at this with respect to the acts of discrimination. They were, if 5% of the time people are discriminating, that's the same thing as saying 95% of the time they're not. So that sort of gives the, in some sense, a feel for the idea that really there's just, it would seem like there's not that much discrimination out there. So now you have a paradox, right? Because you have these new studies seeming to show that discrimination occurs at these, not zero, but at these very low levels. And yet the audit and audit type studies show fairly dramatic, at least race differences in treatment for employment type things. So I got myself in some trouble when I posted a blog and tweeted about these very low levels of discrimination in these studies. Not exactly trouble, but like some people were outraged and this is absurd and all this sort of stuff. And I think the outrage wasn't justified, and the sort of the harsh pushback was kind of ridiculous. But underneath all that, they actually had a good point, which is you do have this sort of dramatic discrepancy, which got me thinking, what the hell is going on? How could it possibly be that discrimination from an acts of discrimination standpoint runs at a very low level of 3% or 5% or even 8% or 10%, and yet 35 to 40% of the time when when people are applying for a job, they show white favoritism. This is like definitely a puzzle. So I don't even remember what prompted me to do it, but at some point I realized that these were not the same. These numbers were different. They were referring to different things. One refers to acts of discrimination. The other refers to experiences of discrimination. So once I realized that, I was like, well, can I link these two? Can you mathematically link the two? And that turned out to be ridiculously easy. I mean, you need a moderate amount of numeracy with about 8th grade level math. But you don't need calculus, you don't need geometry, you don't even need algebra to do this. You need to be pretty comfortable with percentages and kind of those kinds of equations. And it turns out that in treating the 36% as a hard number, which it's not really a hard, is the truth 36? No, that's what the studies have found. That's the truth. Does that mean out in the wider world, the real number is 36%? Well, no, it might be 30% or 45% or 15%. I mean, we don't, but the number from the studies is 36%. And you can very easily get there with only, that is, you can have people experiencing discrimination 36% of the time, even though people committing discrimination is in low single digits, 2 or 3% of the time. And the numbers are entirely compatible with each other. That's the resolution to the discrimination paradox, that the numbers look like the research is in conflict with each other, but they are actually entirely compatible.
Yeah. I mean, is there a way without, spelling out the equations, is there a way to explain how this is resolved in slightly more detail?
I don't really have an easy way to see it without the math. So, so I have to reuse the math, but maybe this is simple enough for people to follow. If you have Black and white people applying for 1,000 jobs, and Black people get 100 callbacks, with the 36% figure, that means 136 white people are going to get callbacks. So that's fairly easy to see. So the difference is 36, right? It's 36%. But there are 1,000 jobs. So 36 is 3.6% of 1,000. So acts of discrimination are only occurring 3.6%. And that's because, there's you have 100 Black people and 100 white people getting callbacks, and you have whatever, 900 black people, or whatever, 400 black people not getting callbacks, and whatever, 364 white people not getting callbacks. So you have lots of people who are being treated identically, not getting callbacks, because most people don't get called back for a job. And so the overall level of discrimination is quite, so the acts of discrimination are low, and you still end up with black people being discriminated against 36% of the time, which, if you're a black person looking for a job, that's kind of major obstacle. I mean, it's, it's not 90%, but, that's a pretty significant level of experience of discrimination. Is going to make it significantly harder to get a job.
Sure is. Yeah. It's clearly a big gap.
Even though very few firms are discriminating. So that's, you need the math. The math is simple, but you do need it. Maybe, if I was a better person, I would have some like soaring narrative that could explain it without the math, but I just don't have that. And it does, for me, it speaks to a number of these like hot button, issues that have, the rhetoric around in the world. So, when people from these sort of historically marginalized groups are complaining about, and expressing grievances about how they're mistreated and they experience all this discrimination, in some circles they're often dismissed as sort of grandstanding and hypersensitive and all this sort of stuff. But the numbers don't justify that. The numbers are really pretty clear that, I mean, anybody can exaggerate anything, but at the core, that seems pretty justified. But at the same time, when, whether we're talking white people, privileged, wealthy people, people in positions of power, deny engaging in discrimination, mostly they're going to be right also. They're not engaging in like defensive white fragility. They're not unwilling to acknowledge their roles in perpetrating racism. They're simply stating what, in most cases, there are going to be some exceptions, but they're simply stating things that are mostly true. So then that raises the question, now what the hell do we do? And I don't really have any easy answers to that, but it does kind of look like, for the most part, everybody, what people are saying, even though they sound like they're in conflict with each other, they are actually both true. And it does raise the question, now what?
This is super interesting. I mean, I think at least most of these findings are quite solid by now. And I think it would be great if more people could hear about them. Because as you said, it shows that, two things can be true at the same time. These two things seem a little bit incompatible, but as you were showing, they are not. And again, I will make sure to send the audience to that link where they can follow the calculation. It's relatively easy. So yeah, it's nice, and it does show that those narratives that have had people very fervently yelling at each other for a while now can be sort of both true at the same time. It can be true that many people can face the effects of discrimination, whereas discrimination is not perpetrated by many people. It's quite interesting.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, if you apply it, I don't know how well it applies beyond the studies that I'm trying to understand that prompted me to do the essay on this. But America is in many places still highly racially segregated. So imagine some suburban area or even some city that's almost all white. The people who live there, maybe there could even be a high level of racism in their hearts and souls. But if everybody around them is white, they don't have an opportunity to engage in racial discrimination. At least not at the individual level. They can vote for racist candidates or something like that. But at the level of, how they treat the cashier or who they respond to for an Uber listing. They don't have the opportunity to engage in discrimination. Like maybe they would if they had the opportunity, but if they don't have the opportunity, they are not engaging in discrimination. So that's like a bigger, my essay didn't really kind of go into that, but
yeah, that's also another subtle point, which is interesting. For our podcast, it's not so much our business to start telling people what they should do, certainly, but in social science, some work can illuminate what practices can improve some situations. And so in terms of what could be done to lower the impact of discrimination, at least as felt on the side of the people who say applied for jobs or stuff like that.
right.
You mentioned things which probably will not work, such as implicit bias training and this type of stuff, which has received so much attention and was sort of taken so seriously by many people, but has really come to it's come to be understood that it's really not very solid at all. I don't know if you want to say stuff about that.
No, yeah. I mean, the implicit bias has been wildly oversold. I think the original like founders and creators of the implicit association test, which is sort of the gold standard for assessing implicit bias, has been revealed to have so many weaknesses and flaws, ranging from definitional and conceptual to methodological and statistical. And it's a parade of flaws. I think it's actually still useful as a research tool, but it really, no one should be making broad claims about society based on the research, because there are just so many weaknesses in the tool. So there's that. And then, it has sprouted these implicit bias trainings as sort of a cottage industry. And there has been work assessing their effectiveness. And there's really there is a fair amount of evidence suggesting they're not very effective for very much other than teaching people about the research on implicit bias. Like, yes, people will, know more about that research, but whether it actually reduces real world discrimination, there's really no evidence for that. And there's a pretty good meta-analysis, like combination of lots of studies, that found that there are all sorts of interventions out there, not just trainings, but all sorts of interventions intended to reduce people's implicit biases as measured by something like the IIT. And some of them have proven successful. You can reduce bias as measured by the IIT. That has no effect on discrimination. So it's like, which is consistent with no one really knowing what the IIT measures. Like, if it really measured racism, then it should be affecting discrimination, but that's like not really happening. So, so the implicit bias stuff is just terrible. It's a waste. It's terrible in the sense that people are being subjected to these trainings. It's a complete waste of everybody's time, and that time would be spent much better elsewhere. And it has an element that is plausibly described as ideological indoctrination into a very, specific worldview involving a very narrow form of social justice. So that's why I think it's terrible. But the idea isn't that, well, it's either implicit bias trainings or nothing. No one is saying, well, okay, now you throw up your hands and just, discriminate. It's fine. Like, nobody is saying that. No, as far as I'm not saying that. And I think there are things you can do if you're in an organization, and you are, whether you're seeking to proactively diversify the organization, which is related to but not identical with, at minimum, ensuring no discrimination as much as you can, in whether it's hiring or graduate admissions or anything like that. There are all sorts of things that you can do. So you can certainly incorporate people with expertise on diversity in everything from hiring, graduate admissions, whatever, and to ensure that the actual merits of the candidates are well understood. Because this could be a problem if if a person from a background, it could be any kind of cultural background that's different than sort of the culture of the organization, people may not really understand what those accomplishments are. They may not as easily be able to evaluate the merit of those accomplishments. Whereas if somebody from such a background or with just expertise in diversity related issues is more involved with that process, they can often bring a clearer lens to understanding what this person's strengths actually are. And then if you're seeking to limit discrimination, simply having that conversation might re-enter a candidate into a discussion who otherwise would have been kicked out. So I've seen that kind of thing happen. But that's a very thoughtful, that kind of thing is a very thoughtful, deliberative process that doesn't rely on unconscious bias or anything like that. So, and then it doesn't really matter if people are approaching it deliberately, even if there is more validity to this sort of unconscious bias than I currently give it at the moment. I am confident. I mean, there are racists, there are hardcore, extreme racists who, wish the Klan would come back, march around with Nazi flags. This isn't going to do anything with those people. You're not going to convince them to change on the basis of this kind of thing. But that's not what we're talking about with this stuff for the most part. We're talking about very different people who are kind of well-meaning, but maybe they harbor some level of unconscious prejudice. But if you lead them to be very deliberative about these sorts of decisions with an eye towards, bias may be real and we need to take proactive steps in order to limit our potential, and here are some steps that we can take to do that, I've seen that be very effective, actually. So no one's absolved from not, okay, the IT and implicit bias, maybe a lot of that work is really dubious. Therefore, throw up your hands and let's just go back to, racism. No, that's not the point. So.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I'm wondering, because I'm not sure this is something you mentioned in your text. Maybe I just forgot. How much research has there been on these practices, which are, well, again, not linked to this implicit bias stuff, but rather to what you were just mentioning, which is more maybe related to cultural knowledge and sort of trying to broaden people's perspectives as to what applicants' qualifications might be?
Yeah. I mean, there's a fair amount of work on practices that succeed versus fail at diversifying organizations. And most of the trainings just don't work, whether it's implicit bias or even a diversity training, they don't work. Having, again, these sort of people appointed in the organization in order to manage or advance diversity. Now you have somebody whose job is to address this, and so you have, both expertise and somebody motivated to, it has a stake in making sure this happens. And those tend to be more successful actually at diversifying an organization. So there's diversity trainings, which are related to, but not exactly the same as implicit bias trainings. And there's been a fair amount of research on that also, and there's just no evidence that they accomplish very much. So, okay. Things can be done. There are some pretty good articles that review the proactive steps that can be taken that are more versus less likely to succeed. But these trainings, I think, have such an appeal to, high-level administrators, CEOs or college presidents or whatever, because they're easy, right? they can be done unrolled en masse. So the whole unit, the whole organization can be subject to it. And now, the public face of the organization can say, look how seriously we take this. We've made everybody take these trainings. And, lots of people are going to find that credible, that's, oh yeah, they're really serious, So it really has this PR value. It also has, a sort of cover your ass value, so that when, if and when someone accuses the organization of racism or sexism or some kind of discrimination, they can say, no, look, we take these issues very, very seriously. Look, we've had these trainings, all of which is very easy for them to do. I don't know, it might be a few $1,000s to hire a trainer or something like that. But if you're a big corporation or you're a major college, a few $1,000s is relatively peanuts. So it's this very easy way to sort of get on a grandstand or soapbox and say, no, look, we are anti-racists, we're anti-discrimination, we take it really seriously. Look, we've hired this firm to do all these trainings, which don't really do anything. And if you actually care about discrimination, you would do something else. But it just, it's like a commercial. Like, do people buy products because of commercials? I don't know, maybe they do, but certainly the people who run the ads think they do. But that's, it strikes me as essentially as having a lot of the status of a commercial. It gives the leaders of organizations the opportunity to present a public face that says some variation of, look how anti-racist we are, without actually doing it, but by doing it easily and on the cheap.
Fair enough. Yeah. And these practices that work better, what would you say are the main differences? I mean, between those that work and those that don't work. I know it's, a work in progress in social science to study that, but from what you understand?
The practices that work are those that involve these sort of deliberative efforts to prevent discrimination. And that, this is why having, an office or a diversity manager involved can facilitate the members of an organization in thinking through what they want to do to limit bias or diversify. And it's those more, and that's going to vary. That's why there's no like simple answer, because hiring a professor for college is going to be very different than hiring a lawyer in a law firm, which is going to be very different than hiring a mid-level manager at Walmart. I mean, these are all just so different that the nature of the things you would do in those situations are probably going to be quite different. Which is why it's useful to have somebody with expertise in these issues actually kind of overseeing and managing the process and kind of tweaking it and pushing people to do, I don't want to say best practices, because no one knows what best practices, but better as opposed to worse practices. So,
fair enough.
A simple thing is outreach, in a lot of, especially professionals, that, you want to maximize the applicant pool from marginalized, diverse groups, right? That's the first step, because if nobody applies to your job, well, then you're not going to hire anybody from those groups. So, and obviously, if you have, 100 people from such groups applying as opposed to 3, you're going to be more likely to find somebody who's really good if you have 100 people applying. So that's like but again, that's thoughtful. That's like, okay, let's identify the Black Lawyers Association. I don't know that there even is a Black Lawyers Association, because I don't do law, but there probably is something like that. And contact, we're looking to hire, let's make sure they know we have a position. And make it as inviting as possible. And, and then hopefully highly qualified people who are affiliated with that organization will apply. And we want to hire a person who's really good. So in this way, the merit and diversity need not be in conflict. The idea is to identify people who are really good, who will also diversify the workforce. But that's very deliberate. You don't need to take an IAT to do that. You don't need a diversity training to do that. So.
Yeah. So I also read this this article to which you link, which is from Wilfred Reilly, which is trying to also see what might be some limitations of these audit studies.
Right.
So these audit studies, just to remind for the audience, they are the first ones which we mentioned, where, for instance, the researchers send actually fake resumes to companies for job applications, and the resumes bear equivalent qualifications, and they see if there is a difference in success that is correlated with demographic characteristics. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, we already discussed this point about, sort of low qualification versus high qualification jobs. So I don't think we need to repeat that.
Yeah.
But there is also this point about affirmative action, which he raises, which is that in at least a proportion, some portion of American universities, there are these affirmative action policies in place, whereby if you're African American, you need lower, essentially high school scores to be selected than if you're, say, European American, white American, or Asian American, especially. So, and in this case, you can say that, okay, two people from different ethnic backgrounds who come from the same university, they might actually not be on the same level, really, of sort of aptitude.
Well, yeah. So, there's controversies about what tests like the SATs or GREs measure. I tend to think they're pretty good at what they do. What they do is fairly narrow, but they're good at what they do. And even though it's narrow, it is relevant to things like academic success or graduate school success. So there is a move across colleges and universities to do away with the GREs for graduate admissions. I think that's picking up steam. I think it's really misguided, but that's just my opinion. Other people would disagree. I don't really see a move away from the SATs for college admissions yet. That may come down the pike, but I don't see it at the moment. But Reilly's point is that is a form of discrimination. That if you need a lower SAT score to get into college, if you're Black or Latino or whatever, than if you're white, then that's a form of discrimination that's never captured in any of these audit studies, and that is really well documented, actually. Now, it's one thing to get in college; it's another to get a job, especially a professional job. And now you're in a complex causal chain. So even if it's true that that for the purposes of affirmative action or diversity or whatever you want to call it, colleges effectively, one may consider it justified, engage in pro-Black discrimination. But even if they do that, it's not at all clear that given the kinds of job discrimination that still seems to be occurring, at least in a lot of the audit studies, that that there's any net advantage to people from marginalized minority groups, because that's where the rubber is going to hit the road. It's not just the college admission; it's going to be when you get a job and make money and enter the middle class or the upper middle class or whatever. So become a lawyer or a doctor. So
yeah. So it would be great to find a way to measure the combined effects of those. But
if anybody's ever done that, I don't know it. So, there is some really good studies from a few years ago showing that that if you offer to pay for high school kids, to
Mm-hmm.
take the SATs. Because some kids are, and this is not just minority kids, this includes lots of poor rural white kids. If you pay for them to take the SATs, and in some cases, especially in rural areas, if you provide them transportation to get to the testing site, you get dramatic increases in the number that get into college and even some of the best colleges. That the mere the obstacle of having to pay for the test or travel to it is enough to prevent a large number of these kids, like large, it's still a minority of the kids, but it's like a large minority of the kids, from even putting themselves in the ring to have a chance. And then when they put themselves in the ring, enough of them do quite well that you get dramatic increases in the number of these kids attending college or even attending the best colleges, actually. So that's a very different way of thinking about removing obstacles to discrimination. I don't know if any of that counts. I mean, it's sort of like paying is an unintentional form of social class-based discrimination. And of course, social class overlaps with race and other demographic characteristics. And so, no one, I don't think the educational testing service is saying, well, let's charge fees so we can keep Black kids out of college. Like, I don't think that's what they're doing. But it may function. When people talk about institutional racism or systemic racism, mostly I think they don't know what they're talking about. This is just a way to fly a flag, look, I'm an anti-racist. However, there is some truth in the analysis as this, the way in which having to pay for an SAT or GRE constitutes what is plausibly considered an unfair obstacle that effectively discriminates against certain people. So in that sense, underlying, a lot of the social hot air rhetoric, there is some truth to it, actually. And that's just one example. There's lots of other examples like that.
Indeed. Yeah. And that's really a very interesting way to look at it. I mean, it makes sense. And I wanted to ask actually, because I don't know myself, and probably many people who will listen to this are also not American, so they and I will have no idea what this SAT fee is going to cost. Is it like a fixed price anywhere in the US, or does it?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, actually. I think it is fixed.
Yeah.
I'm actually Googling it right now.
Yeah.
So the SAT is a sort of nationally available standardized test. It stands for Scholastic Aptitude Test. And it's a standardized test. So it's essentially the same test you get in California, in Alabama, in Minnesota. If you're you live in a tenement in New York City, or if you live on a horse farm estate, in Pennsylvania, you're all going to take the same test. And that's its great value, is that it puts everybody on the same plane. But I don't know how much it actually costs. I don't think it's that expensive, but I don't think it's that cheap either. So it's between $50 and $70.
Okay.
So, if you're poor, that's like real money, actually. So, yeah. I mean, I've been poor enough to know that not recently, thank God, but growing up I was. And, would that have prevented me from taking a test? I probably wasn't that poor, but it also wasn't that expensive when I was a kid. And I definitely applied to fewer colleges and fewer graduate schools than I would have, because it was expensive to apply. So that's another example of the same thing.
Yeah.
So, and that was me, and I was not like dirt poor, but I was probably poorer than most people who ended up in academia. And I'm close enough to that I can see it and taste it, like how that would be a serious obstacle.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for sure, it's already some amount of money. If you have, I don't know, several kids, it's going to be harder, etc. And but I mean, you said there's been some sort of movements towards getting rid of the other one, with which I'm much less familiar, the
The
GRE.
GRE, which stands for the GRE stands for the Graduate Record Exam, and it's essentially the same thing as the SAT, but it's for graduate school. It's really almost identical, but in addition to the regular SATs has two main sections. One is on math skills, the other is on verbal skills.
Okay.
The GRE has essentially the same sections on math and verbal skills, but then there are also domain-specific tests. So you can take one for physics or psychology, or chemistry, or what, like pretty much any field. So, and it costs more to take. So the main fee, so what I gave, the 50 to 70 is for the SAT. I didn't look up the GRE. The main fee is for the math and verbal. You then have to pay more for these additional tests.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, also from what I gathered on Twitter over the past few months, I was under the impression that at least in some places, in some colleges, maybe in some states, I think like California, there is actually some efforts to start doing away with the SAT altogether for college admissions.
Yeah, I'd have to look at that. I don't remember whether that was a proposal or a done deal. I might be a done deal, but I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, same here. I can't say for sure.
Yeah. And I think the intention there is because there are various demographic group gaps in the standardized test scores. I think many people, the people who advocate getting rid of it, see it as an obstacle to, to inclusion, to diversifying the student body, whatever it might be. I think it's really misguided because it's, to me, the standardized tests are like a thermometer. So you're not going to distinguish, if some people have COVID and some don't, you're not going to solve that problem by not taking their temperature. You will now not know who has COVID and who doesn't, but you're not going to solve that problem. And, if people are dramatically differently prepared and skilled with respect to math and verbal skills for college or graduate school, it seems to me like you would want to know that, and you're not going to eliminate that difference by eliminating the test. I mean, that parallel to me is maybe not perfect, but it's very, very tight. But I don't know, and I suspect it is going to the elimination of the tests is going to actually exacerbate certain kinds of injustices and inequalities, because what's left? It's grades and like the nice things people say about you, right? So if you're socially skilled and, you're kind of like good at like sort of, you have an aspect where you're kind of like constructively manipulative, like you know how to play the game, you're polished, you know how to get your teachers to like you. That's what's going to distinguish, and you're going to have a gap between people with those skills and other people who might be really, really smart, but who are like maybe annoying. So, and I think Wilfred Reilly made this point. I don't know whether he did in that article or not. I know the article you're referring to. I cited it, but he's made the point either in that article or elsewhere that that the high standardized test scores have long been one of the avenues by which people at the low end of the SES spectrum, regardless of racial or ethnic or any other background, it's long been a route for them to get out, because those high scores are going to trigger college admissions and graduate admissions, and now you have this path to exit this sort of poverty or near poverty or whatever, working class, whatever it is, which is now going to be invisible.
Yeah. It's I mean, there's always this sort of I mean, I've seen these arguments that you've made before, and I would also tend to be convinced by them. I think also in France, people have pointed that, it's sort of, if you become less demanding in school, with the teaching and the testing, then people with more affluent parents can maybe afford a private tutor, and etc. etc.
Right.
So you will, rather than decreasing sort of measured inequalities, you might actually exacerbate them, as you were pointing.
Yeah. I suspect that. I mean, we don't know. It's a sort of an experiment that's in the process of being tried, and it'll probably be decades before we really have the answer. And by then, it'll be, either I'm wrong, or if I'm right, it'll be too late. It'll be like 2 generations that have had to have that inflicted on them. So, I mean, to some extent, it's personal for me because I was like a really annoying, rebellious student in high school, and I annoyed my teachers, and they shaved points off my grades. And my savior was standardized tests. I just nailed the tests. And that was, so it's very salient to me how that can happen, because it did happen to me. So no, I don't want to overgeneralize. I don't want to make a general, and I'm not making a general statement about the state of the world based on like my personal experience. But there are lots of reasons besides my personal experience to believe that would be true. I am saying that my personal experience maybe gives a little oomph to my, my perspective, the minimum the way I express my perspective about this.
All right. Yeah. That's fair enough. There's also something else which is pointed by Wilfred Reilly in the same article, which is, I mean, according to him at least, I didn't go and check, but according to him, these audit studies tend to target, if you will, maybe businesses which are led by white people, and they don't focus on businesses led by, say, Black people. And he says that, okay, that there is a dearth of studies in that direction, and there are reasons to expect that maybe Black-led businesses would also show some level of discrimination on an ethnic basis. And he also cites those figures which show that, I mean, broadly speaking, all the large ethnic groups in the United States tend to have some level of in-group preference, and they are at relatively comparable level. But actually, what might be surprising for some people, they tend to be, this level of in-group preference tends to be actually somewhat smaller for white people. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, all of that is true. But actually, I love Wilfred. I mean, I really do. He and I are forming a new journal. We're both going to be editing it. We're still working close on this stuff. So I really do. I love his perspective on things. But I think he's not wrong, but he's right in a way that I think probably doesn't really matter that much. Okay. Because, I mean, how many white people are applying to Black-led businesses? Because of because of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and the sort of the long reach of all that, and ongoing discrimination, there's way more white-led businesses than Black-led businesses, proportionately even. And so he may be right. It may be that if some white applicant applies to a Black-led business, they'll suffer as much, racial discrimination as a Black person who applies to a white-led business, or maybe they'll even suffer more discrimination, but it's just such a small proportion of the job market, that I think there he's not wrong, but it kind of misses the mark.
Yeah. Okay, so it's technically probably true, but not a huge factor in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah,
I understand. Yeah, that makes sense. It's I mean, I really love this whole discussion. It's really nice and such a change to be able to have a discussion on these topics, which are, of course, not easy and sort of emotionally charged for many people, and to just look at what the studies say and try to figure out what one can conclude from them.
What? Yeah.
And you know, in general, it's not so surprising, but what tends to emerge is that the simple narratives of the various political sides tend to not be exactly true. There is always, I mean, almost always a sort of grain of truth in it. And sometimes it might be more than that. But I mean, it's interesting to see in more detail and with a cooler head.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I wish that in this sense that the full breadth of the science, which has lots of uncertainty around it, but nonetheless was, sort of deeply thought about for how to go about achieving these goals that I would actually agree to. I mean, part of the dysfunction in societal discourse is if someone like me comes along and says, the IT is really a problematic measure and there's no evidence for implicit bias trainings, you're the response is some version of you're Nazi reactionary, and you're an obstacle to anti-racism. And it's like,
yeah,
I can't. How do you have a discussion when that's the reaction? So it's pretty hard, and that's gotten worse. I mean, it's always been a struggle for scientists, whether natural scientists or social scientists, to get the public to understand and accept, what they have found, even when it's really solid and credible. So that's always a struggle. The tribal partisan nature of at least America's politics has gotten so much worse over the last 10 years or so that has infected those conversations and made them far more difficult for scientists to prompt a reasonable discussion.
It's become. I mean, it was surely never easy, but it's become really hard. And
yeah, well, and part of that is actually exacerbated by at least academic scientists. So academia has really embraced a very kind of a radical far left worldview. And it's not every academic for sure, but especially in the social sciences and humanities, it's large numbers. You're talking, I don't know, 30, 40, 50%. They're often the loudest voices in the room. So even if 50 or 60% don't buy into it, they're usually, they're usually pretty quiet, whether they've been intimidated into it or just don't want to get into it. Just leave me alone, let me do my work. And so the narratives that have emerged even from academic social scientists are often so dramatic, so oversimplified, and I would say outright histrionic, that has exacerbated the problem of having a reasonable discussion about any of this stuff. And so what earlier I said, taking the full scope of the evidence, because which is really important, because like going full circle to the discrimination paradox, there was this evidence of high levels of discrimination, but there's evidence of very low levels of discrimination. All you have to do is ignore the study showing low discrimination, and you can go around, on a soapbox, look how bad discrimination is. It's terrible. Study after study shows it. It's been the same for decades. I mean, I can do that thing. It's not that hard to do that thing. And all you have to do is ignore the evidence inconsistent with it, which is really common in academia now.
Yeah. Okay, that's it's not nice to hear, but it's also not very surprising that it's common to ignore evidence in academia. I mean, so to also sort of go in the same direction as what you mentioned, this maybe minority but loud minority of activist researchers in the social sciences will refer maybe the audience to the interview with Mark Horowitz. Probably you know his work. They've tried with his colleagues to quantify this, which is really interesting and not easy, because it's hard to know what is the difference between the perception of what social science seems like to outsiders and what's really going on there.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I know to what you're referring. So I know of Horowitz, but
So it's Mark,
yeah,
Mark Horowitz. There was this paper, Sociologist Sacred Victims, in
yeah,
particular, with two other researchers, I think, and
yeah,
they try to quantify, what is the proportion of social scientists who outright say, yes, I'm an activist, or yes, sociology's purpose is to improve society, and I'm also a Marxist or a radical or something like that. And they sort of quantified all these things, finding that, maybe like a quarter or a third of social scientists among the sample that they had will say that, yes, I'm really not only a social scientist, I'm an activist.
I did know about this paper. I'm
Mhm.
looking at it as you're talking about it. I called it up, and
Yeah,
I read it when it came out, and frankly, I had forgotten about it. So I
yeah,
appreciate you reminding me about that paper.
yeah. It's also nice to keep in mind because
Yeah,
I mean, as I was saying, right, it's easy to sort of forget that, you often have these activists who just say this is what social science says, and social science says America is a deeply racist country, and that's all there is. And whereas, if you look into the research, as we've tried to do in this interview, it shows that indeed there is some level of racial discrimination, but it's not extremely intense as some people would like to believe.
yeah, yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's also discrimination that neither my article nor anything in this discussion has addressed.
Yeah.
And that's, discrimination around voting and laws. I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
could structure the society to be systemically racist. We clearly did do that for a long time, actually.
Yeah.
So that's a different thing than this like one-on-one, when I'm
Mm-hmm.
evaluating people who've applied for a job, am I going to engage in discrimination? Those are different. Um, and the original layout of the sort of the Kimberly Crenshaw's legal intersectional type ideas
Mm-hmm.
on how the law systematically discriminates, those are pretty solid, actually. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think some of that stuff has gone off the deep end since then, but
Yeah.
but that part of it was really kind of on target, actually.
Mm-hmm. You have in mind things like, redlining and this type of stuff that
Yes,
has,
certainly redlining is an obvious one. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Even the legal protections for people accused of some crime, if you're poor, you can't hire a lawyer. Now you can get a public
Mm,
defender, but the public defenders are in general nowhere near as good as a hired for pay lawyer. So that
right.
builds in a
Mm-hmm.
structural bias against
Mm,
anyone who's poor.
yeah.
And that's still, we have that now.
Can we actually explain to the audience, because again, probably not few people will be Americans listening to this. So could we
Yes,
say
that's all
what
right.
this redlining is? Yeah, I mentioned it.
Yeah,
So it's
yes. So this was officially illegalized in the late 1960s, but I was probably informally practiced for a long time after that. So
mhm,
what banks would do was draw a red line on a map around a community to which they would not provide loans,
mhm,
or would require vastly more credit worthiness, evidence of credit worthiness before they would provide a loan. Um, and this was used mainly to perpetuate racial discrimination, to prevent Black people from getting loans. And this functioned to make it very difficult for Black people to get home mortgages. and
Mm.
therefore constituted a major obstacle to Black people accumulating the kind of wealth that white people, most white people who have any wealth at all, it's in their homes, it's in the value of their homes. I mean, there are richer people than that with 401ks and retirement accounts and, you know, stocks and bonds, but most people's, the bulk of their wealth is the value of their home. And the America's Black population was basically prevented completely goes too far, but there were major preventatives and obstacles to accumulating that kind of wealth, and redlining was one of them.
Yeah. Okay. So I've reached the end of my questions, as you may have noticed. Is there something else you would like to add?
No, my phone has been ringing off the hook. I have like
Okay.
departmental business that I probably should get back to. So,
All right.
but we covered a lot of territory. So I think we sort of covered the ground pretty well.
Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at @CatFreedom and also on Facebook.